So now I will talk about the anatomy of the skull from the anterior point of view. Later I will move on to explain you the skull anatomy from down below and from the inside. Now let's get back to our anterior point of view. You see this big bone right here. It is called the frontal bone. You also have here the nasal bone and the maxilla. Right here, this small bone is the lacrimal bone, and here inside you can see the ethmoid bone. The bone here I have already mentioned earlier is the zygomatic bone, and you have the same bone on the other side, while this bone right here is called the mandible. This right here is not a bone. Basically, it's a major alar cartilage and the minor alar cartilage, as well as the lateral nasal cartilage. If I remove that, you can see here the nasal septum. On the sides you have the conchae that are made by the ethmoid bone, and you can watch that in my video about the nose anatomy in my software. Now I want you to remember something else. You see this right here, that's the supraorbital foramen. And you also have the infraorbital foramen right here, while this foramen right here is called the mental foramen. All of these three foramina are almost in the same line, but that's not the only specific thing about them. They are also specific because branches of trigeminal nerve are exiting the skull through these foramina. If I remove the frontal bone and we zoom in here, this is the trigeminal nerve and those are the branches. So this one right here passing through the foramen ovale is the mandibular nerve, while this one here passing through the foramen rotundum is the maxillary nerve, and this one here passing through the superior orbital fissure is the ophthalmic nerve. Now, why is this a superior orbital fissure? Because it's right here where the eye is. Now, this socket right here is called the orbit. It is the cavity where eye is placed. Superiorly, we have the frontal bone that I've mentioned, and medially we have the ethmoid bone. Posteriorly, we have the sphenoid bone, and on this side we have the zygomatic bone. Inferiorly, we have the maxilla. So before I move on to explain you the mandible, I want to mention that this little bone here, the lacrimal bone that I mentioned at the beginning, also creates the orbit. And we also have the inferior orbital fissure right here, just as we had the superior orbital fissure over there. Now let's explain the mandible, and that's this bone right here. So let's get to it. Let's explain the mandible. This right here is called the condylar process, the condyle of the mandible. And this here is the ramus, and ramus basically means a branch. And branch of what? Well, branch of the body, and this here is the body of the mandible. While this over here is the coronoid process. And between the coronoid process and the condylar process of the mandible, we have the mandibular notch here. If you look at the mandible from the inside, you should be able to notice here the mandibular nerve. And the mandibular nerve goes right here and it enters the mandibular foramen, which cannot be seen on this model. And it goes through the canal here and it exits here outside on the mental foramen. Now if we go back to our position and we look at closely at this point, you should be able to notice the mylohyoid line. Now if that line was not clear enough, I brought the mylohyoid muscles so you can see where they attach. These muscles meet in the middle to create the floor of the mouth. And just above them there is a group of other muscles that attach as well on mandibula on the place called the genial tubercle, which is not modeled here. Sadly, I cannot explain everything in one tutorial, and that's why I explain muscles in other videos that you can find in my software. Now let's stick to the bones of the skull and let's explain what can be seen from down below and inside as well.